To the Big Brown Gadfly, where we give a hard time to people who need to be given a hard time, just like Socrates' horse. I am going to come out and put my cards on the table. I am not a fan of the Southern Baptist Convention. I technically belong to it. I worked at a seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention, and that denomination is plagued with problems. My special guest today, Alan Atchison, is editor of the Capstone report. He has really been on the cutting edge for years, reporting on scandals way before anybody gets to it. And if you think that you know about what's going on the SBC because you read the columns of Sarah Pulliam Bailey or Rob Downen or any of these mainstream reporters, you got another thing coming, because most of what's going on in the SBC is actually shrouded behind these layers of busy work and busy article, silly writing that it comes out that focuses on superficial secondary issues, when the core of the Southern Baptist Convention is, I would say, composed of three things. It's composed of the mission boards, because that's who plants churches, that's who energizes the base and gets out there and shares the gospel. The seminaries, because that's where the doctrine and the ideas of the seminary are fostered, and that is also the institution that trains people who go out and pastor churches. And the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which I believe is a parasite on the SBC. I don't think that we need an Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, but given that that organization has gotten so much public attention and dominates the discussion, and they have invited so many of their political partners into the SBC to tell Southern Baptists how to reconsider and how to change what they think, the ERLC has become very powerful. And what we see in all three of these areas is this is a denomination in crisis. So I'd like to take them one by one. First, we talk about the missions. Alan, would you agree that missions are the lifeblood of the Southern Baptist Convention, because this is the area of activity that is our reason for being? It's supposed to be out there to share the gospel, right?
Right. Thanks for having me, Bobby. Absolutely. That's the key reason that Southern Baptists can work cooperatively. It's that we can do more together than apart. But if the missions organization are woke or have embraced problematic ideas, or just corrupt and careless with the way they spend money, you've got a problem. And I think all of those things sort of tie in to the problem with the North American Mission Board. We've reported about reckless spending, the use of unaccountable gift cards from the North American Mission Board. These are just bad practices that are going on. Plus, the North American Mission Board president, Kevin Ezell, is involved in a lawsuit that is potentially headed for review to the Supreme Court. SCOTUS is actually looking at whether it's going to grant cert to a specific case involving Will McRaney. And in that case, Ezell allegedly corruptly slandered and did other things to harm fellow Southern Baptist Will McRaney. So I think that when there are so many questions involving the way you plant churches, we did a story a few months ago about how the North American Mission Board, one of its church plants that it supports and uses to train other church plants, has its own brewery. Now, I'm okay with the use of alcohol, but most Southern Baptists are not. And I think this is one of the issues that gets buried. Should these SBC elites conduct Southern Baptist Convention business the way they want to, or should they conduct it the way Southern Baptists want it conducted?
Well, and
I'm not so sure that Southern Baptists want to give money to found churches that are creating their own breweries instead of, I don't know, winning souls for Christ.
Well, and let's break this down. All right, the mission boards are broken up into two parts. There's the North American Mission Board. This is the group that goes out and tries to spread the gospel in North America, in the United States and Canada. They plant churches across the country. They are the ones who are out there trying to win souls, trying to get people into the churches, sharing the gospel to people who either have never heard it before or who haven't been converted yet. And then there's the international side. Both of them right now are plagued with corruption. And that's where this Supreme Court case came from. Because what happens is there's so much money that is allocated to missions, and there's no transparency, and there is a layer of incompetence at the top. What we've seen over the last 10 years, and you can go to Randy Adams's website, randyadams.org, and he lays it out. Everything is down, the number of baptisms. The one thing that's up is the budget. We're spending enormous amounts of money to plant churches in North America, but we're losing congregants, we're losing attendance, we're losing baptisms. There are churches that are leaving, so we're actually facing a net negative, where even if we are planting churches, a lot of the medium-sized churches, isn't this fair to say, are actually leaving the Southern Baptist Convention. These aren't dying congregations with 10 people who are leaving because they're just dissolving. These are congregations of 100, 200, 500, 700 people who they look at the direction of where the missions are going and they don't like it. Now, the thing is that the mission boards, part of it is ideological, because a lot of the people who have been given priority in these mission board projects, all of these missions out there in North America to plant churches, they tend to be people who share a kind of liberal urban aesthetic with the people in power, because these are the people who, they went to college in big cities, they feel like they're really hip, they want to come to this musty old stereotypical world of the Baptist church and make it all cosmopolitan. And so they get fast and loose on the doctrine. LGBT is always front and center right there. They want to talk about race where the issue's not really race a lot of times. And then they want to push a lot of the feminist agenda, which is not in conformity with the Baptist faith and message. So that's part of it, is the ideology, and it turns people off. And the people that you gain with this changed ideology can never compensate for the people that you lose who just want to go with there. But then there's a deeper issue, and if you could talk a little bit about the Will McRaney case, there's a lot of corruption there too, right? Even just apart from ideology, there are people who I can't point to anything that they've said or taught that is at variance with the Baptist faith and message. But what the heck are they doing with the money? Why are they firing the people that they're firing? Can you tell us about just the personnel practices? Because that's where the Will McRaney case came from. Kevin Ezell is the president of the North American Mission Board, and what's his track record on how he treats personnel?
He treats everyone, whether they're employees of the North American Mission Board or just partners out in the field like the state conventions, which Will McRaney was at the time executive director of Maryland, Delaware. So Ezell tends to treat people like trash. That's, I think,
right.
He has a reputation of having used swear words at state convention presidents and chairmen, and have been pretty much rude to anyone because that's the way he operates. And unfortunately, that's the genesis of the McRaney case. McRaney did not like some of the strategies and some of the ideas Ezell had for how they were going to do joint missions in Maryland, Delaware. So Ezell allegedly used money as a lever to get McRaney fired. And this is not the only case of that. There are other stories out there that involve similar type of tactics. And we've reported how recently there was a secret call of 12 state convention executive directors with Ronnie Floyd, the president and CEO of the Southern Baptist Convention, detailing just how awful Kevin Ezell is to people. And there was some stunning allegations there of abusive language, etc. And I think there is a real heart problem at the top of these SBC entities. And the North American Mission Board has the largest budget. I think it's about $125 million a year. So it has the deepest pockets. And it's been buying a lot of houses. What are these houses for? Well, they say it's cheaper to give these church planners that they're funding the use of these types of facilities. But there's really no accountability or transparency there. And when we couple that with some of the revelations that have come out recently in multiple articles about the use of gift cards, where they're just giving people $300 gift card, $150 gift card, take your wife out to dinner, do whatever. It raises a lot of questions about what they're doing with this money, how they're doing it. And you mentioned Randy Adams' website. Well, one of the things he did a great job of is show how church planting has decreased while the price per church plant that we're paying per year has exploded exponentially. So that's a huge problem. And you talked a little bit about the overall strategy of the North American Mission Board. It has changed since Kevin Ezell came into power. I think they may be reconsidering some of the evangelism strategies, et cetera. But they had pretty much abandoned evangelism training and teaching churches how to reach their community. For years, they had essentially killed the apologetics budget. So a lot of the things that Southern Baptists had been doing for generations to make all churches healthy, which is to teach people how to share their faith in the workplace or with their neighbors, or helping Southern Baptist kids who go to college know how to endure some of the brainwashing that happens today in the secular college campus. Our apologetics ministry gone, our evangelism training pretty much abandoned. They put all their eggs in the basket of church planting.
Right.
And the research shows, at least the data I've seen, these church plants were heavily weighted to hip communities in the city, minority communities in these major metropolitan areas, and toward immigrant communities in these same vicinities. And they performed abysmally from what the data I've seen.
Yeah, here's what they did. If you look at that, just let's focus on what you just said right now. It's heavily weighted towards stylish urban centers with high ethnic populations. What this reflects is there is no strategy. There are people out there who may or may not even be Christian, who are just looking for some way of experiencing a fun phase of early adulthood where you go and you move somewhere really exciting, you get to meet people, and you have a budget at your disposal, and you throw parties, okay? And so it attracts those kinds of people. They move to Austin, Texas, or to Oakland, California, or to Asheville, North Carolina, someplace that's really, really has a lot of art festivals and I'm totally serious. This is what is going on. That's why the church plants are ridiculous, because the people who are, I've been to some of the church plants, sometimes there'll be like 17 people there, including the 3 kids and the wife of the guy who's supposed to be planting this. They're just being given money to party. There's no other way to put it. And instead of saying, okay, we have got to bring the healing power of the gospel to a lost culture, they go out there and they just want the culture to like them. So they'll actually disguise what the faith is, right? I mean, that's basically what I've seen happen in many places.
Well, you said disguise. That's been one of the jokes that people have told about Southern Baptist church plants in some of these big cities. People will laugh and say, they don't say they're Southern Baptist because they use other names and other terms, and you have to kind of figure it out for yourself. And that they'll say that's, marketing purposes or whatever. Southern Baptist has a bad name. Well, be whatever it is. But you're right. They spend a lot of money in these big cities. It's much more expensive to plant a church in some of these major metropolitan areas than in cheaper suburbs and rural locations. So, for example, outside of Atlanta, right on 285, is this one multi-ethnic. They use it for like 4 or 5 different churches because it's one of the most diverse neighborhoods in America. It's got a lot of different people. They're spending $11 million at least. I've seen reports higher than that in this one community to build soccer fields, mixed retail, new church sanctuary. It is they want to take over this little section of blocks of this little city to make a hip little neighborhood center.
Yeah, and they're going to have the classes on making bracelets and and things like that. And look, I'm a person of color. I'm half Filipino and half Puerto Rican, and I'm going to tell you, I don't feel as though these appeals to ethnic diversity ever are sincere. You could talk a little bit about the allegations of racial discrimination in the NAMB. I certainly have seen massive racial discrimination in the Southern Baptist Convention, often from people who claim that they are part of this woke racial justice movement. They're looking for a base. It's almost like they want to be the owner of the plantation. So they're going and looking for Black and Hispanic and Asian communities because that's their resource. That's their market, right? It's not actually that they're doing anything, because honestly, if they really cared about that, they would be going to sort of the poor communities, which tend to be very conservative and tend not to be interested in this kind of evangelism.
Well, I think you're right that they are sort of they did this with a plan in place. It started about 2010, and Ed Stetzer, who's now a professor at Wheaton, who is a Lifeway researcher and has long, extensive contractual relationships with the North American Mission Board, has told Southern Baptists the future of the church is going to be in immigrant and non-white communities. That's what the data shows, that the church is dying amongst white communities. And if you want growth, you're going to have to go here. So there was a bottom line, dollar-driven decision made to go and try to win these hip urban groups into the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, it could have been that they just wanted more donors, more members, whatever, or it could have been just they really do have a heart for the gospel and want to reach these communities. But there was a definitive effort that happened during the Obama administration when the country, what we thought was going to have mass immigration, overhaul, the immunity to dreamers, etc. And none of that happened, but that's what has, I think, driven the Southern Baptist church planning strategy, and it's been I think it's been a total failure.
Yeah, it has.
We haven't helped our churches replicate themselves, and we've surrendered sort of our base of operations. If you want to use a military term, our churches in the countryside and in the suburbs that were once vibrant and strong are dying. The churches, I mean, look at the opioid epidemic in Appalachia. What are we doing about that?
Right.
Why isn't that a top priority? And if you look at the data, that some of the most unchurched people today are not people that live in wealthy urban zip codes. They're people who live in out in the middle of nowhere. Church going amongst the poor has collapsed.
Right. Yeah.
And it's very disturbing. I mean, I read last month. I read Charles Murray's Coming Apart, the data from 1950 to 2000. I think his book came out in 2013. It's depressing when you read about what's happened to rural whites. And what are we doing to help this? That was once the people who made up the bulk of the Southern Baptist Convention, and we just sort of washed our hands because, I don't know why, but that's what we've kind of walked away from.
I was saved in a Chinese Baptist church in Los Angeles, but that had been founded in the late 1980s. It was well established, and it was a Chinese-run Baptist church. That was a community that's there. There was a large Chinese community, and they were running that church. A lot of these other ethnic churches, you say they want to go for the immigrants. Part of the reason why they do that is because they still want control. They still want their position. They still want their money. You can be Beth Moore and run around talking about Black Lives Matter and trying to be the person who's defending, racial justice, but you still want to have your multi-million-dollar mansion. You want to be able to make all the decisions. And then we saw with Beth Moore leaving the Southern Baptist Convention, it was like, oh, they don't love me enough, I'm leaving. As if, we bent over backwards to make this woman happy. We fired entity heads to make her happy, and then she leaves. The minute that there's a Democratic president in the White House, there's so many things you could talk about that, but she is, I think, emblematic of what we're seeing with this really bad church planning, where the reason why it's collapsing among the poor, and that does not matter what race you're talking about, is if you're just a regular working class or a poor person who's going to church, the kind of programming that you're receiving in a lot of these churches feels really alienating. You feel like there's this pastor who's some soy boy who was trained at some faraway seminary who's been superimposed on your community. He doesn't really understand what's going on in the community. You're using Lifeway teaching materials that are all just written in this distant tone. Everything feels prepackaged. Everything feels so commercialized. It all looks, there's logos on everything. Then, somebody comes to visit your church to do some 7-day evangelism tour, and they're all wearing matching t-shirts that they got from the same brand name store, and they're all singing. You're told to sing songs that are all from the same playbook of 2004 hymns. It all feels so prepackaged, doesn't it? I mean, you feel like
that's actually, you hit on something there that's actually very important. I think there is a distance between a lot of the people who are in these churches and the people who live in the community. And that didn't used to be the case. It used to be the case that the pastor was, he may have used bigger words than people that were sitting in the pews, but he felt like he was authentic and part of the community. So that's actually I think that's a very important observation. And I've been reading Charles Murray's book led me to read Bowling Alone, which has been a just dismally depressing book about how we've become a culture of watchers rather than doers. And I'm not even through the book yet, but that was one of the things that struck me about, he talked about sports. We used to be a country that went bowling or played community sports like softball or baseball or football together. Now we just can tend to watch it on TV or whatever. That's sort of how worship has become. We no longer sing those songs, but we go into these buildings and there's a worship band on the stage. The lights are on them. The house lights are down low, and we watch rather than participate. We've changed a lot of the things that once were part of being a Christian. I mean, I can remember singing out of a hymnal, so I knew the words to songs. Right. And they were important songs that taught doctrine and timeless Christian truths, and we could take them with us wherever we went as kids and into adulthood, and we don't do that anymore. We sing these effeminate songs so often today that I think there was a book a few years ago, Why Men Hate Going to Church. The lyrics of some of these songs are, I hate to say it, but there's a borderline homoerotic nature to a lot of these songs, and what man wants to sing some of this stuff?
Oh, you mean because they talk about their love for Jesus, and it sounds like they're talking about a boyfriend?
I mean, it's some of the lyrics. I mean, there was one example in that book that was just disgusting. It was like, no man is going to want to sing that song. I wish I could remember it off the top of my head, but it was like, I showed it to my wife, and my wife laughed and said, I've heard that song in church. I wouldn't want to sing it either. Yeah. So there are things like that I think really it's become such an emotional experience that focuses on the performance rather than the authentic expression of the people in the pews. And so I think there are a lot of reasons, but you're right, it doesn't feel real to a lot of people, particularly men who are the most unchurched group now in these poor communities.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think a lot of times the topic of discussion in a lot of these new church plants, it veers towards the kind of things that interest someone who graduated from college recently and who watches a lot of news on the internet and who gets all of their understanding of the world off of their Instagram feed. They want to go to the hot topics: sex abuse, I don't know, Black Lives Matter, and so they're having this conversation that just feels fake because it's a heavily mediated conversation. It's a conversation that is drawn from the cues of the news cycle. That's what I really feel like. And so you go in and you just feel like all of the discussion was based on what the discussion leader or the church planner finds interesting. I mean, it's not even like what they want to talk about, it's just the things that they find interesting, and what's on their mind ends up being forced on everybody in the whole church.
And this is horrible. And this is horrible because you said that it tends to be current topics. So that means inherently they're current topics that are political. Yeah. And inevitably, these political discussions skew toward a more centrist or liberal progressive view. I think I can safely say that based on some of the data we've been seeing. Yes. And as I've written before, secular researchers show that the collapse of the mainline denominations didn't really happen because they gave up on doctrine, but it was because the pastors in the pulpit became radicalized in seminary and started spewing anti-Vietnam War propaganda from the pulpit. Right. So what happened is their liberal progressive politics and their liberal progressive theology combined to drive away the masses. And I've argued this is going to kill the SBC because most of the people that are sitting in the pew are conservative. Their inclinations are conservative. So you may appeal to a handful of people in some rich zip code, but you're going to run off tens of thousands in the rest of the community with this progressive nonsense. It's all politics. It's not rooted in theology.
Yeah, not to mention that there's also an optical illusion that sets in because if you go to some of these conferences where they're going to have Jackie Hill Perry as a guest speaker, or Rosaria Butterfield, or some of the popular speakers who go out on the hustings and they do the circuit, you might go there and you say, wow, there's a lot of people at this conference. You may go on social media and say, wow, look at this. Karen Swallow Pryor has like 80,000 followers on Twitter. But you have to remember that you're talking about a generation of millennials that's tens of millions. And these people, they may be the superstars in this one tiny subset of that generation, but they still are extremely marginal in the context of that, of Generation Z or of the millennials. These are people who, a lot of them that might have an inclination to become religious are people who went to college and didn't like that stuff. You know, they don't, especially the guys. This is what I noticed. It's sad that all of these people who are being lumped in with the alt-right are people who have left Christianity. There are all of these traditional men who feel like, you know, the church is just totally toxic. They don't want to be part of it. I see them on Gab, and they're toying with paganism or just they're inventing some kind of Christianity on their own. They don't want to go to church because that stuff is an extension of what drove them out of the classroom and what drove them out of all the other institutions. They're just, it feels like indistinguishable from other things that annoy them, you know?
Well, that's one of the things that worries me. People will talk about, well, the conservative right has been really bad for America. You want to worry about something? Worry about a post-Christian right, because we've seen that before. And it tends not to be pretty because in Germany, we saw a group of people who tended to have more in common with Nietzsche than, say, conservative Christian theology, and it didn't end well. Yeah. Well, we're trending toward that now, but because you're pushing people out from a sense of I belong here. And that's both in the church and in the general political situation in America. And that's really dangerous because when you start doing that, you weaken the ties that keep us all together.
Well, and a lot of times what happens is this current events-based discussion, the current events-based sermons, they're condescending to the audience as well, because often the people who are delivering the message are people who are accustomed to beating around the bush on social media, where you can beat around the bush. You can be really vague and passive aggressive. You can say, oh, white Christians have a problem with race, and not give any specifics, not mention who you're talking about, not name a church or an individual who ever said any of these things, because you're kind of engaging in a frivolous, self-satisfying exercise on social media, right? But you do that in church, and you're delivering this in front of a congregation of people who are there and who live in the community, and they realize that you're kind of talking out of your ear. You're talking around in circles. What are you talking about? Where is our race problem? Who of us is racist? Who of us hates black people? I mean, I think that is a question that comes up all across the country, right?
There are people that you and I are friends with on Facebook,
right,
who go to our seminaries, who recently have posted, I have seen racism in Southern Baptist churches.
Yes.
Okay. Well, what's their name? Because if you've seen real racism, I'll vote with you to kick that church out. But they never come with specifics. It's always this undefined general thing where you say there's racism and I've witnessed it.
Right.
And it's to win plaudits and applause from either liberal Christians or liberal secularists. It's just a stick that has worked and enriched people. It's a grift, and they think that's how they're going to get ahead.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is, this type of stuff kills churches. It always kills churches. You become a liberal on progressive politics, you will see membership and giving die.
Right.
It has happened for the last couple of 100 years in the U.S. because people don't have to be a member of the state church. And real Christians will leave these places and find a church that's wholesome and teaches actual biblical racial reconciliation instead of this nonsense. Like, for instance, Danny Aiken was filmed by the ERLC recently, talking about white people. He said something like, it's not in our nature, but we need to step back from leadership positions and let people of color have it.
Right. Well, let's move to the seminaries then, because that's a good segue into the seminaries. And I'm sorry to take up so much of your time, but there's so much to cover. We have a huge problem right now with the seminaries as well. That's another area. There are 6 seminaries in the Southern Baptist Convention. There are other seminaries that are Baptist that are interspersed throughout the United States. And I would count in this set of problems all of the other schools like Wheaton and Biola and Sanford, places that people depended on in the past for solid, sound biblical teaching. Danny Aiken is the president of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. What we are seeing in the seminaries is, number one, I'm going to give you my take on it, and then you can disagree with me or agree with me. I think number one, we have this imposition. It's a totalitarian environment. There's no academic freedom that's being given to the professors in these places. And as a result of that, there's a little clique of people. There's a coterie, a group of people who have appointed their friends in positions of leadership at other seminaries. And so we have this group of very specific individuals: Danny Aiken, Adam Greenway, Al Mohler, Jason Allen. They know each other. They have common ties. And what's being lost is, are they cultivating a very good learning environment to train future pastors and future evangelists? Or are they running a business where they're trying to run favors for their friends, protect their friends from tough questions, enrich themselves, and then mask that all in the gospel? And if it's the second thing, which we see increasingly at the seminaries, people see through it. It's the same thing. You're going to give Danny Aiken as a perfect example. He gets up there, he gives a speech about how we need to give positions of power to people of color. And what has he done? Did he say anything when Adam Greenway, who's his friend, who has publicly praised, Adam Greenway fired all the black and Latino professors at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, with the exception of one. He fired all the ones that he inherited from Paige Patterson, and he replaced every single one with a white man. Did Danny Aiken say anything about that? No, he didn't. Malcolm Yarnell said nothing. All these people who are doing this say nothing. So, I mean, am I on to what you would perceive as the problem, which is that it's this group of self-interested people who for some reason have seen the racial issues and a lot of these left-wing issues as their ticket to future enrichment of themselves, not of the convention, but of themselves. What do you think?
Well, I think, let me start by saying these are all a bunch of virtue signaling hypocrites. Okay. Danny Akin, the video that just came out that we wrote about on the Capstone report, thankfully not the B picked up from a bunch of people on Twitter in terms of, like, I think Virgil Walker tweeted about it and they saw it there. They wrote a story calling Danny Akin out for this nonsensical ERLC produced video that came out in 2018. Nobody had really, when it first came out, there were like 50 or 60 views on this video before it went viral. And so nobody had really looked at this video. And it's only about 2 minutes long, but he says a lot in there, talks about how we as white Christians need to sit down and be quiet and listen to our brothers and sisters of different ethnicities. And basically he was teaching a standpoint epistemology, and he said we need to give up power. Okay. And he said, basically, kind of like a quote, it's not in our nature to give up power. I guess white people, we don't give up power. That's the
so where did they ever get to the part where they give up power? I'm dying to hear. That's the point. Yeah, let's hear this.
In 2018, this video came out. I'm still waiting on Danny Akin to resign. I mean, when is he going to give up his position of power? Because I know some conservative minorities who would be great at running a university, who would just do a great job, and who would know how to prepare minds. But he's still clinging to power in his six-figure plus job. I mean, again, we don't know how much of a six-figure job. We just know it probably is six-figure based on what I've been able to ascertain from people. But that ought to be, first of all, his salary ought to be public knowledge. But more than that, he's clinging to power and denying it to a person of color. If he were really serious, this wouldn't be the case. Just like Russell Moore would have given up his position of power, but he wasn't interested in that. He took that job over qualified blacks.
He fired
the ERLC at the time.
He fired Craig Mitchell, who
should have been given Russell Moore's job. He's far more qualified.
Exactly. He should. Yeah, he fired him. And
he hired a bunch of non-Southern Baptists too. I forget what the numbers were. I think he hired 5 or 7 new people to the ERLC within the first few months of his time. And I think something like of the 5, like 4 weren't not even attending Southern Baptist churches. They just happened to be associated with the Gospel Coalition.
Well, and what's sad at the seminaries is if you are at the seminaries and you are legitimately trying to provide instruction that is multicultural in nature, you're trying to teach the literature and history of different countries around the world, of different cultures within the United States, you're facing an uphill battle, because ultimately that doesn't sell. Kids want really glossy generalizations. They don't want to have to memorize all those facts. They don't want to read Phyllis Wheatley's poetry and learn about all the Greek and Latin references. They don't want to learn Spanish. For heaven's sakes, we're in the state of Texas. I was the only person on the faculty at Southwestern in the undergraduate program who spoke Spanish fluently, and they fired me. I mean, it's like, they're totally uninterested in quality, substantial instruction. In fact, when they were making the curriculum changes and they eliminated the Great Books program at Scarborough College, where I was teaching, and this is at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, they told us that for things to qualify for a humanities seminar, things had to not be certain things. They said it can't be a survey. They said it cannot be skills-based. It has to be theoretical. And they didn't count languages, foreign language instruction. So if you think about it, basically what they're saying is it has to be kind of dumb. And that's where you get critical race theory. This is why the debate about critical race theory is frustrating on so many levels. Because you have these people that they have spotlighted who bring in critical race theory, and wouldn't you agree? There's such an alarming lack of substance to it. Like, like to have a workshop and talk about, well, we need to acknowledge white privilege. What are you teaching us anything about history? Like, is there an author here that you're going to tell us, give us their literary biography, and then give us facts that we need to memorize, and then we'll have a discussion about it? But it's not. It's all these empty generalizations, and that seems to be that's displacing the history and literature in the curriculum of these seminaries, and it's very scary. And what you're seeing is, as you're doing that, you're actually making it less representative of racial minorities. You're erasing them from the discussion, and instead what you're doing is you're looking for, everyone has to be a little junior Dwight McKissick running around and just instead of teaching people about the history of African Americans, you're just spouting these reactions to things around you. You know what I mean?
Well, I think you hit on something there. It's easier to corrupt minds when they've not been exposed to the Iliad or the history of the Peloponnesian War than it is if they are fluent in these types of great works that tends to have shaped our understanding of both history and humanity. So if you participate in these great works of art, you're able to recognize the lameness of these critical race theory constructs. So I think that's one of the reasons you see the dumbing down of what we do in all colleges, and the fact that it's come to Southern Baptist schools is just really depressing.
Right, and it's funny because that was one of the major battles that I was fighting, and I remember when I got fired, the first article I wrote wasn't about anything dealing with LGBT stuff. It was about the battles that I had fought over the curriculum. And you would not believe how many calls I got from different Christian leaders who they didn't want to deal with the curriculum. They said, this is boring, you're playing the race card. Or they said, this is just not, no one's going to care. No one's going to go to battle over this. They said, we need to see evidence that they're teaching heretical things in the seminary. And I realized that's part of why the seminaries don't get reformed. Because, nobody, even people that we agree with, that are on our side, nobody wants to take a step back and actually go through all of that work of trying to figure out how much of the content has been lost, and trying to recruit qualified people who can teach those things.
Well, I think that there's let me say one kind of tactical reason that people would say things like that. I think it's short-sighted, because these types of things matter, what we are ultimately teaching. But the flip side of that is, from a tactical standpoint, it's easier to reach the masses when you can say, hey, look at this heresy they're teaching. Or you can say, look at how hypocritical they are. So I thought one of the more compelling stories, and I know maybe I'm in the minority here, but I thought one of the more compelling stories to come out of Southwestern was their ultimate recklessness in firing all these blacks and Latinos and other minorities and hiring a bunch of white guys from Louisville. To me, that shows they're ultimately hypocrites. They will virtue signal whatever, but they will just hire the same old good old boys when push comes to shove. But so I think those types of stories are easier to capture the imagination of the masses.
Right.
For you and me, and for a lot of other people who understand kind of, you have to have these foundations in your system. The curricula stuff matters, and we can really talk about those things. Right. But when you're trying to galvanize a movement and explain it to people from a tactical level, I can see why they want to. The video of Aiken is just it's just excellent.
It's rich.
It shows he's full of hot air. He'll say critical race theory is totally not the gospel, and then on video he's saying white people need to sit down and shut up. Right. So I know. And things like that are just easy, and particularly in today's society, we're a soundbite culture. Right. We got to make everything easy to get through the static that is our life.
Well, and the thing about it that's so offensive about Danny Akin giving that speech is, number one, he's not going to give up power, as we said. So this is so. Remember in the book of Zechariah, there's a part where the Lord speaks through the prophet and says, my anger burns hot against the shepherd because they share empty visions and these empty conceits. Like they just sprinkle words on everything. They don't mean anything, and that's what we're facing right now with, I think, a lot of the leaders in the Southern Baptist Convention. It's unfortunate. It just. But I do think that one of the downsides of that, of going after sort of the blatant heresies that you can see, is that they play the people in power, the people who are responsible for the status quo. They have figured out the game that they can play, and they know that if they're not caught saying anything heretical, they could do all kinds of things behind the scenes to move the convention in the direction they want to. And Al Mohler is a master at that because he can, he's the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He has a daily radio broadcast, and he will get on there and he'll say a good turn of words. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, he's firing all the people who teach Orthodox Old Testament Hebrew and replacing them with people who are going to have you do workshops on, how the gospel comes with a house key and you should be hospitable to people of other races. Just general empty stuff that doesn't give you any meat or information,
Well, I think you've hit on something right there. Al Mohler is who is a candidate for a SBC president this year. He's sort of running as the entitlement candidate. Basically, the SBC, this is the version of Hillary, a less likable version of Hillary Clinton, who it's my turn and you better do it or else kind of candidate. You've hit on something that's accurate. He says everything that's right on his podcast and in interviews, and yet he has as his provost Matt Hall, who said, quote, "I am a racist.
Right.
I will be fighting feelings of white supremacy until the day I get my glorified body." So either Matt Hall believes he's a real racist, or Matt Hall is using a defective version of racism and white supremacy, the CRT kind of definition, that he's just a white guy, so he's a racist. So he's either doing one or the other. If he's a real racist, Al Mohler should fire him, and he's incompetent and unqualified to be SBC president if he doesn't. Or Matt Hall is using a defective, dangerous, corrosive CRT definition of racism, and he should be fired for that. And if Al Mohler doesn't, he shouldn't be president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary or president of the Southern Baptist Convention.
Right. Well, and he also, the thing about that is it would be different, again, if Matt Hall were saying, "Oh, I'm confessing to being racist. Look, racist people can change. I've changed. I'm going to amend my ways, and I'm going to carry out all of this stuff to change the system." That's not what he's saying. It's a false humility. He's just basically, in a certain sense, he's like that man in the Gospels who stands on the steps of the temple saying, "Thank goodness I'm not like that other guy," right?
Exactly.
It's like saying, "I'm racist, but thank goodness that I'm one of the good white people who can see that I'm racist." And and it's a way of forcing other white people to admit that they're racist when they're not. That's the other thing, is that it's just kind of a passive-aggressive way of dealing with it. But if you'll notice that even when they deal with racial issues, when push comes to shove, if there's money at stake, they will backtrack on all of this, which is what they did when all of the seminary presidents joined in this brief that was against critical race theory in December. Remember when they all signed on to that joint letter?
Yes. And they sort of immediately, Danny Akin started backing off on Twitter. And they started trying to make the wording not so bad because they got called out by some progressives for the wording of it. But you're right. They will do whatever they can to please the group they need to please at the moment. And that's not a very good way to show leadership. In fact, that's the opposite of leadership.
Right. Well, and now, look, okay, so let's go to our final thing, which is the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And I think that this it's linked to both the missional and the educational arms of the SBC. This is a small unit. I think how many people are in the ERL seats? Probably just just a handful of people, right? But they have this budget to play around with. They hand out these fellowships like candy, right? And so they have these people who are indebted to them because they got the prestige of an ERLC fellowship. They get to go talk to major newspapers and say, I'm on this Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the largest Protestant denomination. But it's still a small, tiny group of people. And the things that they have chosen to focus on are just utterly bizarre. Let me give you an example and give me a reaction on this. Andrew Walker, who I've had lots of dealings with, okay? In 2017, there was a Latino Baptist church in Austin, down here in Texas, and they were dealing with all of the sex ed in the schools, all of the stuff that goes into what we now call the Equality Act. So they wanted to have a meeting with all these citizens in Austin about this, and we were scared because the Austin Police Department was not going to give us protection. The Southern Poverty Law Center had published something attacking us. Andrew Walker went back and forth. He would, at first, Karen Swallow Pryor wrote to him and said, don't deal with these people because they harass people. I don't know where she got that from. But ultimately, he wouldn't help. He basically said, call the state convention. It's terrible that the SPLC is a terrible organization, but we're not going to be involved. It wasn't on their priority list. Instead, their priority list was issuing the Nashville Statement, which was irrelevant because it was 2 years after Obergefell had already forced all 50 states to recognize gay marriage. And their emphasis was on things like artificial intelligence. Remember when they were big on that? And a refugee crisis and racism, and about how the gospel comes with a house key, so you should hand over the keys to your house to trans men to come and have dinner with your daughter and crash at your house. That's basically what they wanted to talk about. Now that Joe Biden is the president and the Equality Act has been passed in the House and it's pending in the Senate, now Andrew Walker all of a sudden claims that they're all the bravest warriors against the Equality Act. I mean, what's up with the ERLC? Like, what drives them, and why do they end up in these just blatantly hypocritical, very frustrating moments?
Well, I think there's so many things you hit on right there that the ERLC needs to go away. They have a roughly $4 million budget. It's tiny in the grand scheme of the hundreds of millions of dollars the SBC collects and takes in and spends. Yet it has an outsized voice, comparatively speaking, and it's supposed to speak to these issues. Well, unfortunately, we have a lifelong Democrat in Russell Moore, who leads that organization. I mean, he has single-handedly tried to force the SBC to the left on issues like immigration, and he wants to make the pro-life movement pro-life wound to the tomb, whatever that means, which, reading between the lines, he wants to, he wants more social welfare programs. Although I'm not sure which ones, but when you say pro-life wound to the tomb kind of thing, and you want to change the way what the meaning of pro-life is, you're doing it for a political purpose, which is to suppress and eliminate anti-abortion voters as an effective political lobby.
Well, ultimately, they want them to back off. They're not going to.
They want to kill.
Right.
They want to suppress Republican Christian voters. That's Russell Moore's entire purpose at the ERLC. And I used to think the ERLC was needed and necessary. Let me tell you what needs to happen in Nashville. They need to say, this $4 million budget, you get zero. We're killing the ERLC. They can still exist, but we will not fund it at all. Because, it'll take 3, 4, 7 years to get enough conservative trustees on the committee to fire Russell Moore. They just need to defund it.
Yeah.
Stop funding it. It'll go away faster, and just say, we remove our rubber stamp from it. We're done. That's how you fix this issue with the ERLC. They have lied to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in the Will McRaney case. Can
you tell us about that? Because basically, Will McRaney, his case, he was the state convention director for Maryland. Kevin Ezel, whom we described before, fired him over stupid disputes, right? It was something about the money.
Well, he got him. They're independent organizations, and this is and Ezell, you allegedly used money, the threat of withholding money, as a lever to get Maryland, Delaware to fire McRaney. And then Ezell committed other alleged acts of slander, and he tried to keep McRaney from getting another job after. I mean, this is a petty, vindictive. I mean, jerk is kind of too nice a word for him. I mean, he's a really bad guy, and he oversees a $125 million SBC budget. But he's really, really good friends with Russell Moore, and Danny Aiken, and they all, Russell Moore and Ezell and Al Mohler all went to church together in Louisville. Ezell was Al Mohler's pastor, and Moore was on the pastoral staff there with Ezell. So Russell Moore's ERLC filed a demonstrably false legal brief, amicus brief.
Okay, so Russell Moore, who's the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, filed a brief in support of Kevin Ezell, the jerk, right?
Right.
He filed a brief, and in that he claimed something that was false, didn't he?
Right. He claimed in this brief that was filed jointly with the Thomas More Society, an amicus brief, that the Southern Baptist Convention is a hierarchy and the North American Mission Board is over Maryland, Delaware, which is demonstrably false. You ask a Southern Baptist, is there anybody over your local church? And they will tell you no. Mm-hmm. This is the hallmark of how Baptists operate. They work together, but there's no hierarchy. They're independent corporations. They're independent religious communities. This is really important because Russell Moore knew that brief was false. They filed it anyway, and when they got exposed for it, they had to apologize for it, and eventually figured out, oh, yeah, we better file something with the Fifth Circuit. They filed a letter to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals saying, whoops, we made a mistake. We didn't mean to mislead you, but we did.
And then when he was caught doing it, then he blamed Catholics. This is hilarious. Yes. Because
in exclusive audio that we have on the Capstone report, Russell Moore blamed the Thomas More Society, no relation, for the false brief. Even though he admitted reading it, and there's proof of that, they had to submit it too. So even though that he blamed the Catholics for not knowing how we operate, and he threw on some anti-Catholic bigotry on top of it by talking about how I don't like working with those Catholic guys because they killed a bunch of our Protestant ancestors in England. Okay, fair enough. He thought he wasn't being recorded and he could get away with his cynical anti-Catholic tirade, which, by the way, just a few months and years before, he's talking about how wonderful it is working with Catholics because we all share these same convictions. So, okay, before he liked working with Catholics, now he doesn't like working with Catholics because they killed our Protestant ancestors. Fast forward to March 18th, he files an amicus brief in this Will McRaney case. It's before the Supreme Court now. They haven't decided whether they're going to hear the case or not. The case is before the Supreme Court, and they're reading briefs and trying to understand it. He files an amicus brief. Russell Moore and the ERLC have joined with the Mormons and the Muslims to file an amicus brief before the Supreme Court. Now, think about this. The guy who was upset about working with people who killed our Protestant forefathers in England will work with a Muslim group. And how many millions of people have Muslims killed in jihad? I mean, if we're really going to go there, this guy is a cynical hypocrite, and he thought his little cynical lie, he would get away with it. Fortunately, it was recorded. So now we know who and what he is, and who and what he will do to save his job and to save his buddy's job. Mm-hmm. It's really sad.
Yeah, it is really sad. And then for him to, what's so sad is that Kevin Ezell's conflict with Will McRaney really just shows a lot of the abusive labor practices that go on within these denominational organizations. I told you about how the professors at the seminaries had absolutely no academic freedom. They were constantly being threatened. They were being told what they could publish, what they couldn't publish. And they would do things like, in my case, they fired me on December 4th and cut off my pay immediately 3 weeks before Christmas. And, I have 4 mouths to feed in my home.
It's sub-Christian. It's sub-Christian.
It's sub-Christian. And they protect that by saying that it's religious liberty, that the government can't interfere with how these denominations operate because that's somehow the state interfering with the church. So they love that separation of church and state on the issues where that means that they get to throw their weight around and abuse everyone that they can and not get questioned about it and not get regulated. But all of a sudden, when it becomes separation of church and state, meaning that the Bible has to be followed and you can't let these secular political issues like LGBT encroach upon you, all of a sudden they're all okay with cooperating with the state. You know what I mean? So it's very one-sided. It's very manipulative. And that I think is what's the biggest tragedy, is for them to use religious liberty as a cover to just be able to create these little fiefdoms where they abuse people.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a lot of things, and it's an entirely different topic, but maybe it's something that we can talk about in the future. But you hit upon this labor practice type of stuff. They think, and they've made the almost market ideals of the labor market, you can fire anybody anytime you want to, into sort of this tenet of Christian faith. And look, I'm a free market guy. However, I'm going to say, as a Christian, cutting off someone's severance package a couple of weeks before Christmas is sub-Christian. It's just disgusting behavior. And there needs to be consequences for people like this who claim the name of Christ and then behave like this. You know what? If you want to be a secular company and fire people, okay, you do whatever you think you need to do. But when you're getting paid by Southern Baptist and you fire someone and then you behave in this manner, such vindictive way, I think the average person in the pew would just find it upsetting, because they could understand what it would be like to be right there with a family right at Christmas and have no money coming in. It's just these are not good people, and I think that's the most depressing thing for me.
Well, yeah, and
because I have heard so many stories over the last few years, and I view myself mainly as a political and type of commentator. I think about these issues. That's what got me thinking deeper about theology and apologetics and all of these things. But I hear these stories of just bad behavior, and it's heartbreaking.
Well, and it's terrible, and it has really led me to believe that this is not a Christian denomination, that many of the people who lead it are not Christian. I mean, Jesus said, you know the tree by its fruit, because this is behavior that is so unbecoming. You have to think of how many people we're losing, and we may possibly be driving away from Christ. That is what is so sad, because of the way that these abuses go on. And the underlying crisis is that we have a class of people who have been making money and who have been building their careers at the top of the Southern Baptist Convention, and they believe that this convention belongs to them. Forget about the fact that the Bible tells us that nothing in this life belongs to us. They're not even anywhere near that realization. They actually believe that the buildings, the endowments, everything belongs to them, as if it doesn't belong to the Southern Baptist Convention, as if the people who donated all of the money that went into the real estate and went into the endowments of all these organizations weren't giving the money to serve the kingdom. That's the thing. The donors were giving money because they believed in Christ. They wanted people to see the kingdom advanced. They were not handing over property to a group of people to be able to shuffle among themselves. And so you see that sense of entitlement and that distorted sense of ownership When I was in a meeting with the provost at Southwestern, I came there with two Southern Baptist pastors who had graduated from Southwestern. And I said to the provost, look, this institution belongs to these men. It doesn't belong to us. And the provost said, no, it doesn't. It does not belong to them. He said, I've been appointed by the Southern Baptist Convention as the provost. Basically saying, I own the seminary, not them. That's so unchristian, first of all. But it's also just bad leadership, no matter what kind of organization you're in. You're there to serve that institution. You're not, it doesn't belong to you. But I think that these different principles and different entities, they move everything around as if this all belongs to them. And there's almost, it's so arrogant. But I don't think that we can cure that in any other way. And this is why you and I are in a discussion forum. And I just basically think that the next president, the only way that they can turn this around is they need to call for mass resignations of people on the trustee boards and people in leadership. There just has to be a massive public reckoning, and we need new blood. We need
absolutely.
We need to go outside of this circuit. I don't want to have another protege. Okay, so for instance, Adam Greenway, he's the protege of L. Mohler, and he has his little protege Colby Adams, who I dealt with when I was at Southwestern. I don't want Colby Adams to be the new fresh face. No. That's more of the same. We need a massive turnover. We need people who are not part of this circle of friendship, and of insider dealing. So,
absolutely, we got to have change, and there has to be a massive turnover, and that's what Nashville's about.
Yeah, so we got to focus on that. I will be doing a couple more shows on this before Nashville. I really want to thank you for taking the time and speaking to me, Alan. I'm sorry we went a little bit long, but there was a lot of information there, and I'll stay in touch. All right, thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
All right, thanks.
All right, take care.